Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm really excited today, not just because I'm recording with Charlie, but because we have an absolutely amazing guest with us. Who have we got on, Charlie? Tell us.
We are very lucky today. We have got Dr. Eilish Gregory with us today. Now, she is a doctor of early modern British history. Yes, we're going early modern, we're going 17th century, so that's why I'm here. She's also a postdoctoral research associate at the Royal Historical Society, so we are getting some quality guests today, Alina. Eilish has held research fellowships at the Folger Shakespeare Library, at Durham University and at Marsh's Library, and she teaches at the University of Reading. She's on today because her book, Catholics During the English Revolutions, 1642 to 1660, Politics, Sequestration and Loyalty, was published by Boydell Press in March, and she's very kindly agreed to come and talk to us about it today. So hello, Eilish.
Hello, Charlotte. Hello, Alina. Thank you so much for having me on today.
I'm really looking forward to this. Do you know why? There's a reason behind this, because you have an eidetic memory and you're going to teach me something.
Well, I'll do my best.
So we're going to learn a bit about kings and queens. It's kind of sad that I don't know this. I will learn. One day I will learn this time period. I promise you.
So we were joking that Alina needs to get the special ruler that I'm sure many of our listeners have picked up either for themselves or for a friend at one of the many amazing museums we have around the country. And it is the ruler that has every single monarch of Great Britain listed down the ruler and the date that they came to the throne. So the joke is here that Eilish has a very, very special talent to share with us. For your listeners, I've just told Charlotte and Lee before we started that since I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, I've known all the dates of the kings and queens of Britain from 1066 to the present day off by heart, and it wasn't down to me memorising them. I just have this memory that's like a sponge sometimes. so it was great when I was doing like periodic tables for GCSE chemistry and stuff like that. Wasn't so good for practical things like maths and everything. Oh, amazing. This is great. Okay, so shall we test her, Alina? What do you think?
Do you know what? I think you're going to have to test her because I have no idea where we're going with this.
Because I have the ruler. Okay, we'll start with an easy one. King Richard III.
1483 to 1485.
Awesome. Okay. King Edward IV.
Well, this is an interesting one because he was king from 1461 to 1470 and then 1471 to 1483.
Amazing. Okay, so I was just doing my favourite Plantagenet there. Okay, so who should we have? John.
King John was 1199 until 1216.
Gosh, you are incredible. Okay, because everyone else is going to be getting very, very bored. Unless they're playing along at home, let's have this one. King Charles II.
1660 to 1685. Though as an added bonus, to add to that, lots of acts of parliament in the early modern period would date from when Charles I had his head chopped off in 1649. So a lot of the illegal stuff would actually be from 1649 to 1685. But for continuity purposes, most things just go from 1660 to 1685 when he got the actual crown back on his head.
Awesome. I'm with you. I'm going from 1649 on that one, better, just to be controversial and to annoy all our Commonwealth listeners. So we are going to be talking a bit about the Civil War today. So very, very interesting time that a lot of people have been very put off from learning at school. I think it's a really exciting time, but we should perhaps begin before the Civil War. So we're going to be talking about the situation for Catholics. What was the situation for Catholics like before the Civil War? Because I know that anti-Catholic penal laws weren't exactly a 17th century inventions. So where did Catholics and their estates stand at that time?
Yes, well, thank you. So as you just pointed out, it wasn't a new thing that appeared out of nowhere. So for the position for Catholics, that since the Reformation in the 16th century, so going back a century before, Catholics had been had been in a very awkward situation in Britain for having gone from a majority religion to a minority religion. And so when Elizabeth came to the throne after her sister, the Catholic Mary I, died in 1558, Catholics were supposed to follow the established Church of England and to conform to Protestantism. And so they weren't punished initially for the first few years, even though they could be presented for not going to church and they could be fined. But we don't really see any legislation regarding their property and estates until around the 1580s. And that's when we start seeing the Jesuit Missions coming to England to try and get Catholicism moving again as such. And obviously this is a big political threat to the Church of England and to Elizabeth's throne, because obviously Elizabeth had been declared a bastard, so she'd been declared illegitimate, and they were worried that Catholics could potentially try and overthrow her, like had happened in other places in Europe at the time. And so what they decided to do was they decided to punish Catholics for non-church attendance by sequestering their property. So that's confiscating their property. That's their houses, their land, their estates, their personal goods. So, you know, it could be their crockery, it could be their libraries, it could be anything like that. And so they'd have those things confiscated from them. But in order to get it back, they had to to conform and go to church, or they had to pay a fine based on the value of the estates, and that was normally about 2/3 of the value. Although sometimes you can get different rates depending on your status, your gender, that sort of thing. So it could be like 1/10 or something like that, or if you've got dependents. And so until you paid that fine, you couldn't get your property back. And we started to see it change as well in the early 17th century. So after the Gunpowder Plot in 1685, James I brings in this legislation in 1606 to try and deal with the Catholic threat, because obviously they potentially nearly blew them up in 1605. And so what they decided to do was that not only did Catholics have to be, could be sequestered and have to pay fines based on their value of estates and fines not going to church, that they also had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king and to his authority, and that the Pope had no jurisdiction over Catholics in England, which obviously created some problems for Catholics. And this is a thing that we see come up quite a lot in the Civil War. And so you see this sequestration system in force for many decades before the Civil War. And so you have this system of sequestration and compounding happening, where estates were sequestered and then fines, the compounding fines, were paid up so Catholics could have their properties back and pretty much be technically left alone by local officials and others. And it was as an acknowledgement that they were being punished for not conforming, but be left well alone once they paid up their fines and just generally carried on behaving relatively well after that. So that was pretty much the situation before 1642.
Well, I think a lot of us are all now completely freaking out at the idea that we could have our books taken away for not behaving and not towing the line.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Did these anti-Catholic laws, did they kind of flare up at various times? Because you mentioned the Gunpowder Plot, so I'm guessing there was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction after that.
Yes, definitely. So, 1605-6 is when you start to see it really clamping up, and in the few years after that. Because obviously people thought that, after this plotting had been going on, that there could be other secret underground ones happening. And every time there was a threat, because I think what we forget sometimes is it's not just a domestic threat in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, but it's also an international threat. So if things are happening on the continent as well, that has repercussions as well. And so the First Years' War from 1618 to 48, you start to see some bubbling tensions about the Catholic situation, like could this happen in England as well? But what's really interesting was that during the Spanish match in the early 1620s, when James I was trying to negotiate with Spain for his son and heir, Charles I, the future Charles I, to marry the Spanish Infanta, you see the penalty of sequestration pretty much almost lifted up in some respects, in that Catholics weren't being presented as much in the local quarters, the assizes or the quarter sessions. And sequestration is not as highly utilised. So you start to see that they're trying to, because they were trying to do that to try and win to get the Spanish on side to get the marriage negotiation sorted. So you see that. But what's really interesting is that in the 1630s, bearing in mind Charles I has his personal rule where he's ruling about Parliament for 11 years, and he has a French Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria. He really ramps up using sequestration compounding as a means to target Catholics, whether they were rich or poor. Because normally before, you had to have a bit of property to be sequestered. Catholics could be fined for not, of all status, could be fined for not going to church. You really start to see it clamped up in the 1630s because he needed to raise money. So it became a much more like well-oiled machine, but designed to really reap in the money. So he wasn't really on the side of Catholics, really, because he saw it as almost like an extra like money bank as such to get money off Catholics.
Gosh, because that's really interesting. In the run-up to the Civil War, Henrietta Maria is very much used as this kind of talisman for the evil councillors and the Catholic influence on the king, isn't she? So that it really he wasn't giving Catholics a good deal. Everyone was getting a bad deal.
Yeah, and I mean there were some Catholics who were given exemptions. There's an example I used in the book of a man called John Carroll who had actually been given a special exemption in the 1630s. But normally you have to have a bit of money and have a bit of influence to get those types of exemptions. But yeah, it's quite interesting that, obviously there were Catholics being favoured in the court in the 1630s, especially in Henrietta Maria's circle and the big Catholic conversions of people like Sir Kenelm Digby and others. But Catholics are still being, financially squeezed in a way with compounding and sequestration. So it's a very weird situation for Catholics in this period.
Gosh, they can't have known where they were standing from 1 minute to the next.
Yeah.
I find this very interesting with the whole idea of religion and politics and it all being interwoven. You've already mentioned to us what sequestration is, but how does Parliament actually decide to use these powers?
Is this during when the Civil War breaks out, do you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so obviously when the war breaks out in the summer of 1642, Parliament is obviously trying to work out trying to deal on different fronts. So obviously they're trying to establish the fact that, the King's just declared war on them. But also they're trying to use this sort of rhetoric that, the King has been badly advised by evil counsellors, the same old rhetoric that you hear across the centuries. It's always down to bad counselling by your close-knit circle. So initially, Parliament decided to try and target those who they believed to be the causes of the Civil War breaking out, of the English Revolution breaking out. And so they're not really targeting Catholics as such. They're targeting those who they deem to be popish, which is normally tied with Catholicism, but it's those who are politically motivated to try and usurp the true Reformed Protestant religion. And so in their eyes at this time, it's figures like the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and the bishops, and those who had, used popery in the churches in the 1630s when the beauty of holiness as such. And so when they're really redoing the churches up as such, because they've been sort of left to disrepair in some places, and so they believe that by revamping some of the churches and just giving a bit of love and care and repainting stuff and changing the old position stuff, that was popery. That's going back to the old Catholic ways. And so they're targeting people like that, and they're also targeting those who they were believed to wrongly supporting the King and not supporting Parliament's liberties and the true Protestant religion. And we have to think back just a few months before the Civil War broke out in January 1642. This is when Charles I had attempted to arrest 5 MPs in Parliament, which is why today the Queen cannot go in the House of Commons. She can go in the House of Lords when she opens Parliament, but she cannot go in the House of Commons. No royal can go in there because of what Charles I did.
Yeah. She has to knock.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I never even knew that.
Yeah, I mean, I found out a couple of years ago when I was teaching that when the Queen opens Parliament, she has to, get dressed up in the room in front of the death warrant of Charles I. I think it's a bit of a grim reminder of what happens if you overstep your powers as such, like Charles I did. And so this is the situation that Parliament's dealing with, is that they're dealing with people who they think are acting in an arbitrary, popish, absolutist way as such. And so they're punishing, so the first several months, these are the people who they're targeting. They're not necessarily targeting Catholics as much. But after lots of negotiations and different acts and bills going through and ordinances, they decided to, in March 1648, after loads of readings and everything, to target archbishops, bishops, deans and chapters, target royalists, and those who they deem to be popish, but they also include Catholics in there. But so it becomes a much more inclusive legislation, whereas before it targeted those who were deemed popish recusants and recusants. This time it's including a much bigger body of people, which is why there's about 265 volumes of compounding petitions in the National Archives for this reason. It's because it suddenly includes a lot more people, whereas before it just included a population of which people estimate between 5 to 10% of the population of Catholics, and suddenly thousands of people being sequestered.
Gosh. So do you think that what happened at this point was that effectively Catholicism and just practicing Catholics in their own homes were lumped in with this sort of fear of arbitrary rule, that they were going after Lord and the deacons and that sort of part of the Church of England with?
I think they would have definitely felt it was a very different system and situation to one they'd been in before. This is the problem with the period sometimes, is the word Catholicism, popery gets interchanged so much that it meant different things to different people. And so so sometimes if you were called you were a papist at the time, then it normally meant you were Catholic, but then people could use it to attack you politically as well. Or you're being too popish. And so Catholics probably were quite used to that, but suddenly to be lumped in with these other groups meant that they probably felt that this was a very, very different situation to what they dealt with before.
Gosh. So what did this mean for the Catholics who were used to sequestering and compounding under the old system? How did they adapt to what Parliament were doing at this time? Or could they just say, do you know what, we're used to an old system, we're not having a new one, we refuse?
They pretty much had to adapt if they wanted to get their estates back. And what's really fascinating with the English Revolutionary period, and this is why people should study the English Revolutionary period in general much more, is that this coincides with the lapsing of the Printing Act in 1642, which not only means that there's an explosion of all these printed sources coming out, with all these pamphleteer writings and everything like that, but it also means there's a lot more parliamentary acts and ordinances being printed and orders. And so petitioners, whether you're Catholic or you're or a royalist or anything like that, you can actually learn how to what the process was about, the new process. So you could actually pay for the new sequestration ordinance and know what the terms and conditions are, what you're going to be sequestered for, what do you need to do to get your property and estates back. And if you've been sequestered because you were caught up in a siege in a royalist garrison, for example, it will tell you who's included and who's excluded from being allowed to compound their estates and on what terms they can do that. And especially in the 1650s and 1640s, you really see Catholics and delinquents referencing these specific acts and ordinances and orders to compound their estates. So sometimes you'll get a Catholic saying, or delinquent saying, I'm sequestering, I'm compounding under the terms of the Articles of Newark. So it will say where they've been captured, for example. And sometimes they'll say under this act passed 1651, I'm entitled to X, Y, and Z. So it's really, really fascinating. So they probably weren't happy that they had to learn a new system, because you wouldn't be, because you're used to a system that had been going for quite a long time, and suddenly having to learn a new system would have been not only complicated for those who'd never been sequestered before, but it's going to be complicated for those who'd been compounding for estates for a long, long time, but can suddenly find themselves charged not only for recusancy, but they can be charged for what they say, royalist delinquency or papist delinquency or delinquency. So again, you see all these interchangeable terms being used. And so it became a lot more complicated for everyone, but particularly Catholics, just because they had been sequestered and compounding in that process before.
Gosh.
So, talking to a 20th century historian here. Okay, I'm going to bring this up.
History, she calls it.
Modern day politics.
Yesterday.
Exactly. Can you explain this to me? I mean, how did the Catholics frame their petitions to get the best deal? Because that's what you want. You want the best deal from Parliament for their estates.
Yeah, well, exactly. What's really fascinating, so I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of petitions, mainly obviously from Catholics, as that's what the book's on, but obviously I've also looked at other delinquent ones as well. So they all follow pretty much the same pattern. So you'll say, I am such and such. So, for example, I could say, the John Savage, Earl Rivers, for example. And you'll say your status, whether you're a gentleman, a peer, yeoman, whatever. And then you'll say what you've been sequestered for. So it could be recusancy, papist delinquency, etc. And then it'll say why you think you should be allowed to compound. So whether it's because you were proclaiming your innocence, or you had been fighting for the king, but you've seen the error of your ways pretty much, and that you're a loyal citizen for Parliament. And then you'll normally say on the next part what things you've done in order to compound for your estates, whether you've paid the first half of the fine, which is known as the moiety, or you've sworn specific oaths of allegiance to Parliament, whether it's the negative oath, the oath of abjuration, the protestation. There's so many different oaths floating around at this point, so you normally have to say which ones you've done. And then you normally have to have the evidence to back that up with, whether it's a certificate from those who witnessed you swearing these oaths, or someone confirming that you've paid the fine. And then you submit that, and then you hope that they will let you officially compound as such. And normally you had to do this in a place called the Committee for Compounding in London. So normally when the process started, you would submit your first petition as such to the County Sequestration Committee where you lived, or normally sometimes where you were captured. Normally it's going to be in your home county as such, because normally that's where you're found when you're captured. And then it again gets sent to London, and then you have to actually go to London to present your case. And then that's where you hopefully to compound for your estates. And so that's pretty much how all the petitions, by and large, follow the same formula across the 1640s and 1650s. So it was always really fascinating to see how they changed. So when there was one, you get the occasional one where it's not quite in that form. It is quite interesting, but it was very rare for that to happen. So pretty much it all followed the same structure: who they were, why they were, what they were sequestered for, why they believed they should be allowed to compound, and what they had done in order to prove that they should be allowed to compound.
Gosh, this must be the most fascinating bunch of archives to get in, not just from the point of view of finding out who was what, who was where, who owned what, but also this wonderful sort of petitioning for yourself, and oh no, I wasn't really doing that, and I'm being really good now, and I'm going to behave, and I've seen the error of my ways. How long could you just lose yourself in all of that documentation?
Quite easily. And because what I did for the book was not only did I look at the Committee for Compounding Petitions and the sequestration order books in Kew in the National Archives, but I also I had quite a lot of case studies, you probably saw in the book, so I went to a lot of the county record offices or the personal family papers as well. So I was travelling across the country checking it. And what's really fascinating is sometimes you'll get actual copies of the petitions that you see in Kew also in the county record office. It was really nice to see if, first of all, if they replicated it correctly, but also if things have added extra bits or anything like that. And it was really, really fascinating to try and see follow the paper trail across the years, because it wasn't like it was done and dusted in a few months. Sometimes these things will go on for years, and so it was really fascinating to see that progress go along, and different people appearing or not appearing, and how how these things just dragged on for a long time. So you can really see the long-term effects this will have on an individual or on a family as a whole. So I loved it. I still love looking at sexually compounding petitions.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could only see the looks on these two ladies' faces right now. Okay, Charlie is like, oh my God, this is so amazing.
I find it completely riveting because, you know, my area, I mean, I love the Civil War. I think more people should know about it. My area is a little bit later and during the Restoration. And of course, there are so many interesting Catholic figures, whether they are open or covert in their Catholicism, and you fall in love with the family, and you realize that there's one couple and all three of their sons end up in Rome, and you think, oh, of course they were a Catholic family, and you look back and you realize, yep, they had secret priest holes, and you can't help it, can you, Eilish?
You become quite attached to them because they become quite real and personal to you. And you know, when something bad happens to them, you actually really feel it, even though it happened, you know, centuries ago.
Exactly. Oh, we're total nerds. So, I mean, they just you forget that people, despite it being a very long time ago, were in fact human people with lives and concerns. So what were the relationships like between ordinary Catholics and ordinary Protestants at the time during the Civil War? Was it beef on the streets, or did everyone just get along? Or?
Well, as you can imagine, with most time periods, it's not quite as straightforward as you think. Answers, because obviously sometimes there's that perception of like, oh, because it's Catholics versus Protestants, you know, that they're going to be clashing, you know, almost like a muskets at dawn type of behaviour.
A West Side Story, yeah.
Yeah, you know, two houses and all that. But no, what's always been quite fascinating, especially when I was doing the preliminary research to this, is that, as you can imagine, even today, you trust those who have been around in your area for a long time. So so you get a lot of Catholics in local communities get on incredibly well with their Protestant neighbours and with Protestant officials, because even though they're following the wrong religion as such, you know, as long as they live quietly and they're not trying to cause trouble, you know, they participate in their society, they're going to be getting along quite fine with them. It's only those who come in from nowhere, the aliens, as they get dubbed in this period. That's when you get suspicious. Like, well, who are they? Do we trust them? What they do? Are they going to cause trouble? And so, actually, even before the Civil War broke out, you would sometimes get Protestants who would either overlook things or not represent their Catholic neighbours as much at local sizes. And sometimes you'd even get Catholics not having to pay such a higher fine for not being, for going to church. Because normally you had to pay a certain amount of money per week. But once it reached 4 weeks continuously of not going to church, for example, you had to pay a £20 a month fine, which obviously is going to cripple you in this time period. And so sometimes what they would do, some local officials, that they would present the Catholics for 3 weeks and then not present them for the following week. And then so they'd pay like 20 pence a month, or something along those lines. I can't remember what the exact pence was per month, but basically pence per month versus £20 a month is going to make a massive difference.
Yeah. So you can almost game the system. Yeah. So poor.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, especially for some officials, you want to punish them, but you don't want to literally ruin them. Because at the end of the day, you're going to, especially for some officials, you're going to lose your cash cow as well. You don't want to fine them so much you're not going to be able to get money out of Catholics on a regular basis for some cynical ones. And so you get to this position in the Civil War where, I mean, obviously you're not going to get good relationships with every place. So obviously if you've got long-standing feuds, that's not going to work very well. Because they're the ones that are going to target you. But during the Civil War and the interregnum periods, it's really fascinating in that you still see this relationship forged quite well in